Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Genetically modified foods are a source of great controversy. There's strong opposition to them from some, but others are unconcerned. What are the facts? Do GMOs and glyphosate have a secret health risk? If so, what specific risks are involved and how can they remain on the market? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the Exxon Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to take a closer look at GMOs and glyphosate is Jeffery M. Smith. Jeffery is the founder and executive director of IRT, the author of Seeds of Deception, and award-winning filmmaker. As a global thought leader on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms, for over 27 years, he's authored 2 bestsellers, directed 5 documentaries, delivered 2,000 lectures and interviews in 45 countries, trained 1,500 speakers, and organized more than 10,000 grassroots advocates. Jeffery has counseled world leaders on 6 continents, and his meticulous research presented at medical conferences inspired thousands to prescribe non-GMO and organic diets. His website, responsibletechnology.org. Jeffery, thank you for joining us on Mission Evolution.
So great to be here, Gwilda. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. So, how did you first become interested in GMO and glyphosate?
Well, in 1996, I went to a lecture by a genetic engineer, and he actually is kind of a whistleblower in that he was doing research on DNA for cancer. And then Monsanto decided that they wanted to introduce GMOs into the food supply. And so he announced in his lecture that there was no way that Monsanto or any company or individual could genetically engineer the DNA and change it in a way that was predictable and safe. And so the changes that they were making by creating Roundup ready soy, for example, soy crops designed to be sprayed with the company's Roundup and not dye, that was going to be put into the food supply and exposed to virtually everyone in the country and many people in the world. Moreover, once you release genetically engineered organisms into the environment, you can't recall them because they can self-propagate. So I was kind of shocked at this news that I had never heard of at the time.
Yeah, very shocking. So, I saw at one point a young girl that was kind of taking on Monsanto about the not labeling, and she said, I'm not telling you can or can't or whatever else. She's just a young girl. I just want to know what's in my food. And the argument went round and round and round and round. Do you know if they ever got to where they had to at least label it?
Well, there's about 65 countries that require labeling of some sort. But the United States labeling laws that were produced by the U.S., by actually the USDA, are as if written by the biotech industry. There are so many loopholes and so many ways that a genetically engineered substance can avoid being labeled. And they try to say, well, you can put a QR code on, so make it hidden, or put a toll-free number under some circumstances. Or instead of calling it GMO, we'll call it bioengineered. So right now, if you see a product that says made with bioengineered ingredients, that means GMO, and it's designed to confuse, because people know, the biotech industry knows, the US government knows that people don't want to eat GMOs, and for good reason. As we'll hear today, there are many, many diseases associated with the consumption of GMOs and the Roundup herbicide or glyphosate toxin that is poured onto many of these genetically engineered crops.
So you mentioned that once you plant them and they start growing, they continue to propagate. Do they start to distort? Does the DNA stay modified, or do they start to create their own nightmare?
It's an excellent question. And it turns out there was a report done several years ago about the changes in the DNA and its expression after GMOs were introduced. And absolutely, they do change. They're not stable. Now, it's not necessarily every single GMO will change, but over time, there's a lot of shifts that happen. You see, we don't understand yet the language of the DNA and how it works, and yet we're acting as if we do. So sometimes you'll release a genetically engineered corn, for example, that's engineered to produce its own toxic insecticide to kill insects. And it produces a certain amount of that toxin. I've talked to some friends who did some research in one field. There was dramatically different levels of that toxin produced. In some cases, levels that would be extremely dangerous, in my opinion, for human consumption or exposure. Although I think that that toxin is dangerous at any level. And in fact, many of the scientists who were advising the Environmental Protection Agency said, no, this could be a toxin or an allergen. And the EPA said, we're not paying attention to you. We're allowing it on the market and calling this corn a registered insecticide.
So why were they're supposed to be neutral and kind of policing stuff? Why did they ignore the clear evidence?
It turns out that many of the regulatory agencies are captured. I'll give you an example. The White House told the FDA, USDA, and EPA back in the 90s, early 90s, promote GMOs, get them on the market, use existing laws that were not designed for GMOs. We don't want to give it to Congress to create new laws. So the FDA brought in Monsanto's former attorney, Michael Taylor, who was in charge of policy at the FDA, and his policy claimed that there was no difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, therefore no testing or labeling was necessary. He then became Monsanto's vice president. Documents made public from a lawsuit years later showed that it was actually a lie. That in fact, not only was the FDA aware of the difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, the consensus among the scientists tasked with recommending policy said that GMOs could create allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and had urged their superiors to require long-term testing, human toxicological testing, and all of that was ignored. Similarly, at the EPA, documents made public from a lawsuit showed that the Monsanto company had as if their own people working for them in the EPA getting things approved over the objections of others. So we have seen the incredible influence of corporations over regulatory agencies in GMOs and Roundup.
So it sounds like the FDA, what they police is the Food and Drug Administration's company's bottom line.
You know, they call their clients the companies that are asking for approval rather than their clients as the American people. And I've done some analysis or investigations into the FDA. There's whistleblowers there that describe the problems there, same as the EPA. In fact, when Monsanto wanted to approve its bovine growth hormone, a drug injected into cows to increase milk supply, Michael Taylor, their former lawyer, was in charge. Then Susan Setchen, who had done research for Monsanto on bovine growth hormone, took up the role of overseeing the review at the FDA. Then Margaret Miller, who had done research for Monsanto, became in charge of a department that evaluated her research. And so it was basically a captive situation and a revolving door. Many of the people in the regulatory agencies will move back and forth between the companies that they're supposedly regulating. And we saw that with Monsanto as well.
Mm. So let's back up just a little bit. Would you, for our audience, I think everybody assumes they know what GMOs are, but what are they exactly?
Genetically modified organisms are ways in which we take the DNA and make changes artificially. We can put in genes from foreign organisms, like they did with Roundup Ready crops, taking genes from bacteria to make the crops not die when sprayed with Roundup. Or you can go in with gene editing tools and move things around. Now, they claimed for years that it was safe and predictable, when in fact the most common result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects. It can create massive collateral damage in the DNA, which could increase the levels of existing allergens and toxins or create even new ones that have never before existed in those plants. And so the situation is now there's a, quote, new form of genetic engineering called gene editing, like CRISPR, and they claim that they're saying, oh, this is much better than the old version, and yet it is full of problems. In fact, the journal Nature described it as chromosomal mayhem. And because they've convinced governments, the biotech industry has convinced governments that it is safe and predictable and even natural, which it isn't, governments all over the world are saying, fine, gene edit whatever you want, put it in the food supply, put it in nature, change the microbiome, take control. They've given the keys to the kingdoms to anyone with even $2,000 to buy their own CRISPR kit. In fact, you don't even need that. You can just go to a high school classroom in many places and be assigned to change the DNA of organisms that could be released to change the nature of nature.
Well, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature, right? So, um, is there also impact on the nutritional value of these foods that have been altered?
Very much so. There's been comparisons between, for example, genetically engineered corn and natural corn. I've seen the side by side, and there's a dramatic reduction in the nutritional value. There's also an increase in uh, some of the toxins in there as well. The genetically engineered corn of one type has a gene that was turned on that produces a known allergen called gamazine. There's another genetically engineered corn that has higher levels of putrescine and cadaverine. These are, I know I hate the names. Actually, I love those names, but they really convey what it is that they do. They create the foul odor of rotting dead bodies, and they also are linked to allergens and cancer. So there's a lot of changes, and yet the biotech industry is not required to do an evaluation of all those changes. Remember, it was Monsanto's former attorney who said no testing or labeling is necessary. So the basic studies to see, well, what's actually different in the two aren't done by the companies. They're often done independently, and there's not a lot of them, but when they do the independent research, when they can get the money and the grants, they discover significant differences that can be quite dangerous.
Significant differences in the outcome that the independents come up with versus the ones that are working for
Right.
Monsanto?
Not only in the composition, but also in its effect on laboratory animals. So Monsanto will run a 90-day study and stop it there and say, oh, it's all good. And oh, this change here, it's not related to the biology. This change here, it's not related to the glyphosate or the GMO. And they say it without any scientific justification. But scientists that have evaluated it say, oh, wait a minute, this shows real signs of toxicity. And those that have done longer studies have shown the growth of tumors, damage to the kidney and liver, multiple massive tumors that were 25% the body weight, early death, organ damage. And when they come out with their information, they're attacked by an kind of an echo chamber of front groups and individuals who are given a certain set of talking points that we see all over the world to try and discredit any individual or organization that might say that GMOs are dangerous and unhealthy.
Well, it's time for us to take a short break. Jeffrey and I will return shortly. Please don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Is our food making us sick? With us this hour discussing GMOs and glyphosate is the author of Seeds of Deception, Jeffery M. Smith. His website, responsibletechnology.org. Jeffrey, you did considerable research, I understand, um, on the GMOs and glyphosates. What did your research consist of, and where did you get the information to do it?
I interviewed dozens of scientists and doctors around the world, and oftentimes these are scientists that have discovered problems but have been fired, stripped of responsibilities, forced out, censured. My book, Seeds of Deception, opens with a story of Dr. Arpad Pusztai, who discovered that the process of genetic engineering creates massive damage in the rats that were fed the GMOs, and that it was the process of GMOs, not a particular specific change that he was doing in his potatoes. Now, he was working with a grant from the UK government to come up with protocols for how to test GMOs that were going to be implemented EU-wide. But when he discovered his problems, we hear that a phone call from Monsanto went to Clinton, that went to Tony Blair, that went to the institute where he was working, and he was fired the next day, basically after 35 years, and he was told not to talk about it. He was silenced with threats of a lawsuit. And I went into the whole detail in the first chapter of how the political influence was designed to cover up what he had discovered that may be unfolding inside all of our bodies. And so some of the research was from these type of whistleblowers or scientists that had discovered information. And I also did some of my own interviews with people who have shifted from GMOs to non-GMOs or non-GMOs to GMOs. We surveyed 3,256 people who reported getting better from 28 different conditions at about 150 lectures around the country. I asked for show of hands in terms of how many people noticed getting better when they switched to non-GMO, what they got better from. So I've been interviewing people, and I did a film with Amy Hart called Secret Ingredients, where we look at about a dozen individuals who got dramatically better when they switched to organic food. Organic because that eliminates both GMOs and the glyphosate herbicide. And it wasn't just one-offs. The doctors in the film say this is actually typical of the patients that we see every day who we put on an organic diet. And the scientists in the film say this is why. We have little animations of the different body systems and say glyphosate does this and glyphosate does that and GMO does this. So I've had the honor of being able to collect all this information from many scientists who are focused in their particular specialty, and I've had a chance to put it together in a couple of books and also some movies and talks and training programs, etc. And it's very, very strong evidence.
Now, I understand, and we, of course, can't put them up here, but I understand you have some charts that relate the GMOs to and glyphosates to human health. Where did you get the information for those charts, and what do they show?
Dr. Nancy Swanson and Dr. Stephanie Seneff were primary researchers, and they went and collected public data, CDC data, etc., hospital admissions, death rates, etc., from specific diseases. And they took USDA, the Department of Agriculture's statistics in terms of how much genetically engineered corn and soy are planted each year, how much glyphosate-based herbicides are sprayed on those each year. And they had a curve of the amount of GMOs and the amount of glyphosate. And then they put on the same chart the specific rise of these diseases. And the correlations are breathtaking. Autism is nearly a perfect correlation, 0.9975 compared to a 1, which would have been perfect. There's diabetes, obesity, allergies. There's hypertension, deaths from hypertension, deaths from Alzheimer's, deaths from senile dementia, all sorts of cancers. There's a tremendous body of evidence in the correlation that these things are moving in parallel. Now, correlation, as you know, doesn't prove causation. But we also have the evidence of 3,256 people who got better from many of these diseases when they switched to organic. We also have the animal feeding studies that show that the rats and mice that were force-fed GMOs and Roundup suffered from these same set of diseases or their precursors. We even have the plausible pathways, the biochemistry, saying, well, what does, for example, glyphosate do in the system? Glyphosate, when you take it in the system, it shuts down the production of a precursor to serotonin, which is a precursor to melatonin, which help us go to sleep. So the insomnia and sleep disorders rose in parallel with the amount of glyphosate in the US food supply. When people get off of the GMOs and glyphosate, they get better from insomnia. So we have a very specific example. The number one most common reported result in terms of getting better when switching to organic was digestive disorders. 85.2% of the more than 3,000 people we surveyed said they got better, and most of it was significantly better from digestive disorders. So I published a peer-reviewed study in the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, which gave the results of the survey and then did a deep dive showing all the ways that GMOs and glyphosate and the insecticide that's in the corn could be contributing to a deterioration of the digestive health in the United States and around the world.
So we haven't talked about glyphosate really specifically. What is it?
Glyphosate was originally patented as a descaler to clean inside boilers and pipes in industry. Now, it grabs onto minerals. It's a chelator, and we normally think of chelators as, oh, let's get rid of the heavy metals. This grabs onto all the metals, and that's why it was a descaler, because it would clean off the metal deposits. And when they put the effluents into the ground, it would kill all of the weeds and all actually anything living. And so Monsanto then patented it as an herbicide, and it's part of Roundup herbicide, most of them, but not all of the Roundup now. And it's also been declared by the World Health Organization as a probable human carcinogen. But it's also linked to many, many other disorders. And it was the biotech industry, in particular Monsanto, was very convincing to the administration that, oh, it's completely safe, there's no toxicity. Well, it turns out in the lawsuits that were now charging carcinogenicity or cancer to Monsanto and Bayer company that bought Monsanto, they were forced to show all of these documents, and that the documents about how they tested glyphosate and declared that it was safe were, according to the scientists and the lawyers that I spoke to, based on fraud. I'll give you an example. When Monsanto they had to see how much of the Roundup was absorbed into human skin. So they took human skin from a cadaver and put Roundup, and about 10% went in, which was over 3 times the allowable level. So they had an idea. They took new human skin from a cadaver and they cooked it in an oven. Got it really tough, but that wasn't good enough. Then they froze it. And they took that cooked, frozen human skin, applied Roundup, and hardly any got absorbed. They reported that level to the EPA without telling them that they had cooked and frozen human skin. They had hired an expert at carcinogenicity to see if their Roundup or glyphosate caused cancer, thinking he would clear it. He said, oh, no, they're showing that there's genotoxicity here. In fact, it could be even more with the whole formulation. So they fired that guy. They said, we're not going to use him anymore. And according to the court documents, they ghost wrote their own study, a review, and got scientists to sign the name that came up with the opposite conclusion. Their early studies were done by a company that was so full of fraud that the people went to jail, including one of Monsanto's executives that went from Monsanto into this testing company and then back to Monsanto and then to jail because of the fraud that was used on the animal feeding studies that got these things approved. I can go on and have gone on for hours to show how they rig their research, cover up the information, but also attack or fire scientists that have discovered it. They've attacked me, they've done all sorts of things, and it's standard practice now in order to keep profits flowing.
So you brought up another interesting thing. A lot of our cattle, a lot of our food is, I've heard you aren't what you eat, you are what you eat. Okay. What's happening to the livestock that's first being fed this treated GMO corn and soy, and then it ends up on our table? What goes on there?
The majority of feed fed to cattle and other livestock in the United States is the Roundup ready soy, corn, cottonseed, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa. Those are the 6 Roundup ready crops. Now, first of all, when you spray Roundup on these crops, normally glyphosate should kill, but when it's genetically engineered, it doesn't die. The glyphosate gets absorbed into the crops and then stored in the grain or food portion. So if we eat these products, soy, corn, etc., then we can't wash it off. It's inside. The animals eat this. Now, it turns out the crops themselves have very much lower levels of minerals and nutrition. The glyphosate, as you remember, is a chelator, and it grabs onto the minerals. They may be in there, but they're not usable. They're being hugged by this molecule, and they're not going to be used by the system. So we have massive mineral deficient crops, but there's also residues of the glyphosate in these foods, high levels. The animals eat them, and it then grabs onto additional minerals and causes leaky gut and causes all these other things. But in terms of minerals, it makes them less available. And the minerals are important for the immune system. They're important for cognition. In fact, they're like the keys that turn on all the motors of all these biochemical pathways. And when you don't have these minerals, it's like the workers are on strike. So we've had massive problems with the livestock in terms of fertility and health, etc. Then they become mineral deficient. So now we, as humans, we eat the animals that are mineral deficient and sick. We eat the GMOs that are mineral deficient and have glyphosate residues, which then draw more minerals out of us. And that's just the minerals. But if we look just at the minerals, they're related to all these different diseases. Similarly, I threw in a word called leaky gut, or a phrase, where the gaps between the cells in our guts can open up. You can see it on a microscope. Add a little glyphosate, they separate. There's a study by a Harvard professor that says all disease is linked to leaky gut. In our gut, there's also the microbiome, the bacteria that turn out to be like a second organ. It helps us digest. It helps produce materials for us. It helps our immune system. There's a connection to our feelings and cognition. It turns out that glyphosate is a patented antibiotic. It kills the bacteria in our gut, but it kills preferentially the beneficial bacteria, leaving the nasty stuff like E. coli and salmonella to thrive. And so the changes in the human gut bacteria, according to one model research, and I interviewed the scientists that helped design it, they can explain dozens of diseases that are on the rise in the US population, rising in parallel with the increased use of glyphosate. So we have leaky gut, we have microbiome, we have mineral deficiencies. These are foundational. Just these alone can cause massive numbers of people experiencing a variety of diseases, but it doesn't stop there. I can continue to talk about what this chemical does and how my friend from MIT realized that this is probably driving the autism epidemic because it fit hand in glove.
We're going to have to pick up on that interesting information on the other side of yet another station break. Jeffrey and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. It is everywhere. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the health risks of GMOs and glyphosate is Jeffery M. Smith. His website, responsibletechnology.org. So, Jeffrey, as we've been talking, I have another thought, if you will. So, you have GMO crops, corn, say, for instance, planted in rows, and across the road, you have an organic farmer. What happens?
Unfortunately, nature doesn't stay in one place. Things are shared. So corn is a good example because corn pollen can fly through the air. It typically it can be alive and survive for 2 to 3 hours, in some cases 24 hours. Imagine how far that could travel and land on other corn plants that may be at the time when it can be pollinated. A friend of mine who was an expert at air pollution calculated that in Texas, where he lived, that theoretically pollen could travel 500 miles and still be viable within the 24-hour period. You can find and corn is pollinated per kernel on those little tassels. So some people will find little blue kernels in corn, and there's no blue corn anywhere within miles, but some pollen had flown. So you end up basically contaminating different gene pools. When I worked at a GMO detection laboratory in 1999 and 2000, even before I got there, they looked at corn seed that was supposedly non-GMO, and there was up to 1% contamination at that time. Contamination will grow over time. Now, how do you eradicate it? Well, at that particular laboratory where I was vice president of marketing communications, we discovered an illegal variety of corn in Kraft taco shells called Starlink corn that the EPA advisor said is a probable human allergen. And it caused $1 billion problem. 315 products were subject to recall. All export markets to corn in the United States closed their doors. It was a big deal. Now, they spent all this time trying to get Starlink out of the food supply. Originally, they found it in 80% of the samples. After years, it was still in the food supply, a much smaller percentage. But it can never be eradicated because you can't identify it from a distance. You can't pick it out. So even if something is in a field trial, like some genetically engineered bent grass in Oregon, 2 decades later, it's still there. They can't eradicate it. They didn't have a proper plan. So we are now changing the nature of nature. It becomes a self-propagating biological time bomb where we don't know its qualities. And that has become exacerbated because of gene editing, where now they're saying, gene edit anything you want, put it in the woods, put it in the ground, grow it, put it in the food supply. I'm sure it's fine. So we're in a situation, Gwilda, where we inherited the products of the billions of years of evolution, nature, but what we may be giving to future generations is a combination of natural and man-made. And the man-made, remember, has surprise side effects and cannot be recalled.
That's terrifying. What's the shelf life, if you will, once you put it on the ground of glyphosate?
Well, it degrades depending on the enzymes in the soil, the biological material, how much clay, pH. It could go many, many months in terms of how long it survives, but the longest reported half-life, how long it took to actually just reduce to half, was over 20 years, like 21 years, I think. And so this says that under certain conditions, it'll just be around. Now, it can be bound up, like remember, it's a chelator. It can be bound up with something in the soil, and you add like a fertilizer or some phosphate, and all of a sudden it breaks open, and now it's active again. And because it reduces the use of minerals, and minerals are important for the immune system, my friend, Professor Emeritus Dr. Don Huber, who was an expert at glyphosate, even did contract work for Monsanto, he says that the use of Roundup widespread in the United States has caused an emergence of over 60 plant diseases, some that have cost billions of dollars to agriculture, and that people aren't putting it together, that it's the glyphosate that's being spread that's causing the damage. And so that's just a little bit of the ecosystem damage. It also damages the microbiome in the soil, among other things.
So does it get into our water supply?
Yes, and it affects the marine life. Now, it's not just the glyphosate, but also the Bt toxin, which is created in the corn. That's that insecticide. That was washed into rivers and found that it damaged the caddisfly, which I had never heard of when I read it, but it's a foundational component of the marine ecosystem. The glyphosate can go into the water, and it can cause problems with the algae bloom, etc. In fact, when you use glyphosate, because it kills the biology in the soil becomes more compact, so it doesn't absorb the water. So the water just flows off into the river or causes flooding. A friend of mine sent pictures of a GMO Roundup Ready cornfield on one side and a natural cornfield on the other after a rain. The one that was natural had no water on it because it all got absorbed. The one that was in the GMO had puddles. So it goes into the water supply. It can promote flooding because it washes off, and then it can damage the entire natural cycle within the water supply as well. And it could possibly create these algae blooms.
Well, what about our beneficial bugs like pollinators, bees, and such?
Glyphosate turns out to be very toxic to honeybees. They lose their direction, their ability to come back to the hive. And it also kills the beneficial bacteria in their gut, the lactobacillus, for example, that they need in order to digest. So sometimes there's plenty of food there, but they starve to death because they're not digesting. Now, there was a company that was identifying the problems between bees and glyphosate and was coming up with evidence to show that glyphosate was damaging. And the company was called Biologics. And they were purchased by Monsanto and no longer came up with any information showing that Monsanto's glyphosate products were damaging bees. But there is evidence that shows a dramatic drop in the bee population, in part because of glyphosate and in part because of something called neonicotinoid insecticides that are put on the corn seeds and on the seeds of others, often on GMO seeds, to act as a insecticide in the soil. So between those two, we're causing like a kind of a huge genocide among the bee population, and these are chemical-based genocide.
The genocide of the bees is going to be genocide of the humans if it keeps up, isn't it?
It's, the bees and the pollinators are essential for our current food supply. I don't know what we would do without them. I'm hoping we don't have to find out.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So if these products are so dangerous, why can't, okay, so the Monsanto has all these people in their pocket, right? Or threatened with lawsuit and everything else. But what's happening? Are you starting to have, is somebody starting to raise up the general populace and say, hey, quit messing with our environment, quit messing with our food?
That was my plan back in 1996 when I heard about it. I decided, okay, so what can I do? I'm not a scientist. I can't do the scientific research to prove it. And if I could, we've seen already that you can have strong evidence over here. And then sometimes the companies will produce equal and opposite research with a different finding that you later find out was rigged to create that outcome. And I've exposed that in my work. So science was not on the table. And I could try a lawsuit, but there was lawsuits that didn't go very well. And we found out that the judge used to work for Monsanto. I can go into the details, but we don't have to do that. I could try legislation, but the biotech industry had locked down the White House and the regulatory agencies. A former FDA official said the regulatory agencies have done everything that Big Ag has asked them to do and told them to do. So I'm thinking, okay, no, I can't. They've convinced farmers, they've convinced media, they've convinced academia, and they've convinced the government. The four main focus areas of their marketing and hype campaign. So I realized that their Achilles heel is consumers. We need to get the consumers aware of the health dangers. So in order for me to say that GMOs are not safe, why are they going to listen to me? So I had to come up with the very specific stories of the scientists that actually discovered the problems and were fired or censured, or their whole campaign was designed to discredit them. And I had to point out what the scientists working at the FDA actually said, as opposed to the political appointees. And so I had to prove the third-party evidence. I had to show the devious ways that Monsanto and others were attacking scientists. And then I had to explain what the health dangers are and focus it on the most receptive demographics. Because as soon as among the population, if even a small percentage of people stopped eating GMOs because they offered no advantage as a marketing agent, they just were there in the food supply. No one was looking for an herbicide-laden product or corn that produces insecticide. It would become a marketing liability. Now, Monsanto had a consultant who announced in a January 1999 conference how they had worked with the company years earlier, asking what their ideal future was. And their ideal future in 15 to 20 years was to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds and patent them. And the consultant worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. So they were planning to genetically engineer the food supply. Another report was at that same conference in January 1999, predicted a 95% takeover of all commercial seeds by genetic engineering within as little as 5 years. By educating consumers, we and others were able to derail that schedule. And now we were trying to get 5% of US shoppers to consciously avoid GMOs. 51% of US shoppers believe that GMOs are unsafe now, 48% worldwide, and that was several years ago. So the way the biotech industry has responded is they've gone stealth. They're saying gene editing is safe, so we don't have to tell anyone, the government or consumers, if we're genetically engineering these products, so there can be no choice in the supermarket.
That's terrifying, quite frankly. And from what you've said, and we'll pick up with this on the other side of a station break. But from what you've said, can we even, we say go organic, but if there's this pollution from field to field, as far as 500 miles, is even organic unaffected at this point?
Great question. Shall we take that up on the other side with specific recommendations, what people can do?
Well, you can start now, and we can take
All
it up
right.
on the other
Sounds
side.
good. Sounds good. So there's mice that were fed Roundup Ready soy for 8 months. They had damage to their testicles, their pancreas, I believe their hearts. Then a group was put on non-GM soy, and things started to repair. So there's a physiological repair mechanism. We had 3,256 people who reported getting better from 28 different conditions and diseases when they switched to organic. So we do know that much of the damage, not all of it, is reversible. The body can repair. Now, there will be some contamination. The amount we have on our site at responsibletechnology.org, we have a glyphosate database that shows how much glyphosate is in how much food, which types of food. It's not
Well,
just.
it's that magic moment. We will pick up with this information on the other side of a station break. Please stay with us as Jeffrey and I continue our discussion. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. So, how do we protect ourselves? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Jeffery M. Smith. His website, responsibletechnology.org. Jeffrey, we were talking about how to avoid GMOs, and you were talking about how the bodies, animals and people, have a repair mechanism. Would you mind continuing?
Sure. So there's two things to avoid: GMOs and glyphosate-based herbicides. I mean, you really want to avoid all of the chemical nasties, so eating organic doesn't allow those. And that, I would say, is the main focus, is to eat organic, which doesn't allow GMOs, glyphosate, and other things. Now, if you can eat organic, then you want to avoid the products that are sprayed with a lot of Roundup and avoid the products that contain GMOs. Now, let's start with the Roundup or the glyphosate-based herbicides. It's not all just Roundup. Now, in 2006 or so, there was reports on Monsanto's website aimed at farmers saying, you can dry down your grain by spraying glyphosate or Roundup on your products 3 to 5 days before harvest. Wheat farmers, oat farmers, legumes like lentils and mung beans and whatnot, they'd spray glyphosate-based herbicides on their field just before harvest. Now, it's going to kill those products eventually, but it does it slowly. It first dries it down, but it also forces ripening. So in areas in the north and Canada, when they want to get ripe quickly, they'll kill it, and all the energy goes like save the kids. So they send all the energy in the crops to the grain. The grain ripens, and everything dries down, so there's less mold when it's actually processed, and they've killed the weeds for next year. It's called staging. And so if you look at our database at responsibletechnology.org, and you look at what has a large amount of glyphosate in it, you're going to find oats and mung beans and wheat and lentils and things that are not GMO. None of those are genetically engineered in this country. You'll also find soy and corn, and then there's cottonseed oil and canola oil, but they may not have much in it because the oils don't carry it as much. But you'll have to find what you eat often that has all this high level of glyphosate And then those should definitely be organic. So like I traveled almost nonstop and I used to have oatmeal in the hotels for breakfast. And I realized oatmeal just floats in glyphosate. So avoid the Roundup and the glyphosate, and then avoiding the GMOs. Also on our site, we name them all, and I'll do them quickly. Soy, there's just a dozen. Soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, zucchini, yellow squash, potatoes, apples. There's a pink papaya now. There's also little ones that are starting to show up. This purple tomato that's coming out of Northern California. There was salmon for a while, but it looks like that has stopped because the company went belly up. And then there's genetically engineered wheat in Argentina and some eggplant in Bangladesh, but mostly those are the ones in the United States.
So people, complain, rightfully so, that organic is so much more expensive than conventional with all the goodies and not so goodies in it. But what about the nutritional factor? If the food that's been treated and genetically modified has lower food value and things in there that block the things we very need, how much of a bargain is it?
I love your question. Nutrient density is generally higher with organic, and regenerative is even higher. Regenerative is when they focus on creating more biologics and health in the soil, which then create more nutrient density in the plant. So if you eat a cucumber and it's been commercially raised, even it's not GMO, just commercially raised, and they spray a bunch of things so the cucumber doesn't have to fight against any diseases or whatnot. So its phytochemical levels are down and its nutrient levels are down and its whatnot. And then you take another cucumber or whatever it is, you may need 3 cucumbers over here to have the nutrient value of the organic, and even less for more of the over here for the regenerative. So I would like to suggest strongly the following recommendations. First of all, put some of your medical budget, your health budget, into your food. I've talked to so many people, and in the film Secret Ingredients that I did with Amy Hart, many of the families that we interviewed say, we don't go to the doctor anymore. We just don't get sick. Many people's health bills go down by a lot less, by a lot more than what they're spending for the extra organic food. Put some of your philanthropy dollars into that, because now you're now contributing to a healthier world and healthier farmers. So make a bigger budget. At the same time, create a spreadsheet, and on the left side, all of your symptoms, all of your how well you slept, your energy level, and your mood. And at the top of each column, what percentage of organic you ate that day. And then 1 to 10, all of the symptoms, energy level, etc. I say this because I was not aware of how many different diseases and disorders are connected with GMOs and Roundup until I started asking audiences 13 years ago. I was like, how many people noticed? I was a little hesitant. All these hands went up. I said, oh, really? What did you notice? Oh, you had digestive improvement. Your brain fog went away. You lost weight. How many others? And I started seeing I was collecting data until I actually did 3,256 people, published the results. And now I'm convinced that there's a wide range of modern diseases that are all ignited and exacerbated by eating GMOs and glyphosate. So you don't know if your skin condition is related, but many people's are. You don't know if your gluten sensitivity is related, but many people's are. Your blood pressure, your mood, cancer, certainly, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, all of these have been shown not only in correlations, but also in the mechanism. So please take a look for yourself. Take some weeks, at least a week, probably more. 2 weeks is a minimum, probably, to get it all out of your system. And see what, not all out of your system, but a lot of it, and see what changes happen when you're strict. So those people that say, yeah, I like to eat organic when I can, when you go out to eat, can you eat organic, or can you at least avoid those things that contain the GMOs and the Roundup? So this, I think, is a life changer. And I can't overemphasize, you don't have to take my word for it. Try it, write it down, record it, and you may be sharing this information on social with everyone you know once you discover how important it is to eat a clean diet.
So I understand GMO point two, gene editing and genetically engineered microbes are in the works. What are we looking at there?
I did mention that gene editing like CRISPR is being used all over unregulated, but I'm mostly concerned with the microbiome at this point, and not just the human microbiome. Microbes turn out to be the micro Jedi army that's working on our behalf. The microbes in the soil basically govern the carbon exchange system, the carbon cycling. The algae in the oceans produce most of the world's oxygen. The mycorrhizal fungi in forests will shuttle nutrients between trees and allow young trees to grow. And the microbiome inside us can determine whether we are fat or skinny, healthy or not, even our mood. The microbes are way out or are punching above their weight. They have a tremendous influence in the planet, in our bodies. Now, one of the ways that microbes work and the ways that they're so intelligent is that they go to big genetic swap meets. They'll pass their genes on. So it says, oh, this one worked for me and gave me a survival advantage. Here, you try it, like Dungeons and Dragons or baseball cards. And they'll pass around their genes. And so there's this big swarming of genes that move from type to type and spread around the world. Now, think about this. More and more science classes in high school, and many of them in college already, have CRISPR labs. You can buy a CRISPR lab for less than $2,000. You can make your own genetically engineered microbes, putting in genes that never before were in the bacteria or other types of microorganisms. Then they get released into the environment. You lick your hands, you touch things. It's going to be easy in a high school classroom and often very easy in college. Now we're flooding the microbiome with new types of genes. Now, many of them will die, the microbes will die, but some will survive and some will pass these around. Now, think of these factories where they take microbes like yeast or algae or bacteria, and they put in genes in order to produce a targeted medicine. Maybe they're producing THC or opioids or something, or maybe some industrial enzyme, because they're turning the microbes into factories. Now that escapes. And now we have these that are producing microbes that are things that are dangerous. Or you have companies that are spreading genetically engineered microbes on tens of millions of acres of agriculture that haven't been properly tested, and their genes may transfer. If we allow this potential destruction of the microbiome, in my mind, it is the single greatest existential threat that's available that could cause damage immediately. There's evidence now, for example, with COVID and others, that it's dangerous to genetically engineer and enhance potentially pandemic pathogens. So there's efforts to stop that. And I think that's great, but it's just a first start because they're not paying attention to biology. Those are the pathogens that we don't want to spread. We all know what they can do. But what about the healthy bacteria inside us? What about the bacteria that's needed by children, the bifidobacteria, to make them healthy and give them a healthy life for the rest of their days? What if that gets corrupted by someone eating something that was contaminated by something from a factory or a school? The basic fundamental healthy stuff, the stuff in the soil, we have to protect that as much as we have to protect against pathogens. So the Institute for Responsible Technology is focusing on that because that to me is the micro elephant in the room, that if we don't protect the microbiome, we could be destroyed.
Well, it's really close to us running out of time, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, Jeffrey. You have about a minute. What's your mission?
Well, it's interesting. My mission has been to protect all living beings and all future generations from the artificial manipulation of GMOs, of the DNA, and the associated chemicals. I'm also working on helping raise collective consciousness, both through information and through techniques that I'm developing, which you and I can talk about in a few months when my new book comes out.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful thing. And Jeffrey, doing what you're doing, it's taken a lot of courage, it's taken a lot of work, and I want to give you appreciation from me and certainly from all of our audience for what you're doing and continue to do.
Thank you. And I think when people live their mission, being this being mission evolution, you don't need courage because it's fearlessness. It just becomes easy to do.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Our guest this hour has been Jeffery M. Smith, the founder and executive director of IRT and the author of Seeds of Deception. To find out more about Jeffrey, where you can find his books and all he has to offer, visit his website, responsibletechnology.org. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join us again right here on the X Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net, where this mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.